What a terrifying world we found ourselves in today, my people. A world inhabited by monsters that strike horror into the hearts of mortal men. Incredible strength and mental discipline are required to survive encounters with these beasts. But what exactly does it mean to be considered a monster? The mutated monster hunters. Witchers.
Just a quick disclaimer. I'm going to be taking most of the information about the Witcher universe for this discussion from the games, since that's more of my channel's specialty. Since the games are meant to be a sequel to the novels and are highly faithful adaptations to the established universe within the books, I figure this won't be much of an issue for our analysis. The world of The Witcher is inhabited by some of the most deadly and frightening monsters ever imagined. Necrophages that feast on human flesh. Insectoids that tower over humans with toxic venom fatal to the touch. Vampires that can not only tear a human apart with their bare hands, but can also be just as, if not more, intelligent than humans. Humanity needed some way to survive in a world where these monsters were, and continue to be, an everyday occurrence. Thus, the Witchers were created. Humans that have undergone dangerous mutations and intensive physical training to be able to survive battle with these creatures, thereby providing humanity a solution to their struggle for survival. Naturally, one would assume the role of a Witcher is simply to slay these monsters that inhabit this world. However, their job entails much more than that. While the blade of an ordinary human may be guided by fear and hatred for these creatures that appear unnatural, a Witcher's blade is guided by education and reason. And trust me, my people, it is this distinguishing fact about Witchers that makes them effective monster slayers. But what you may not expect is that the title of monster is not exclusive to non-human creatures, or at least it's not for Geralt of Rivia. With his encyclopedic knowledge of monsters and his experience traveling the world, Geralt understands that humanity can be just as monstrous as any Leshen or werewolf. Humans are not uniquely exempt from such a title. In fact, humans aren't necessarily a natural product of the world they inhabit either. The conjunction of spheres was a cataclysm that affected the whole multiverse. This occurred 1,500 years ago, in which a multitude of different dimensions collided with each other. Numerous and distinct races and species were tossed into the same world, and were forced to fend for themselves in this new and foreign land. These races included gnomes, dwarves, elves, halflings, and several other races, but among them were also the first humans. Yes, humans are not even the native race of the Witcher world despite their dominant presence. Even vampires, the classic monsters that are usually the result of curses or an agreement with a higher demonic force in most fantasy stories, are another race that were unfortunately torn from their own dimension. Humans are not the natural product of evolution in this world, surrounded by unnatural abominations, but are instead one of several other races trying to adapt and survive to this world. While ghouls, graveyears, drowners, and other monsters appear to be evil atrocities that plague the world, they are also living artifacts of the conjunction, some even having no ecological niches of their own within this new world. Therefore, within their respective dimensions, they are actually natural species. But here in this new world order, they are considered unnatural abominations. These creatures have been given the title of monsters by humans because they are frightening creatures that, more often than not, feast on humans. But not all of the creatures that are labeled as monsters are deserving of the title, nor are humans exempt from such a title. There are several instances where Geralt has encountered monsters that aren't very monstrous. Godlings, for example, are woodland creatures that tend to dwell in burrows or hollow stumps around human settlements. They're similar to children in appearance and behavior. Godlings tend to avoid contact with strangers, but can become incredibly social once they've identified someone as safe to talk to, or even as a friend. It is because of this reason that godlings tend to befriend children more often, since they tend to be more innocent and non-judgmental than adults. There's no better example of this than Johnny, a godling who often played with the neighboring children and regularly sang to their caretaker. Johnny even helped Geralt in his search for Ciri to repay the favor of getting his voice back. Another godling named Sarah demonstrated that they have some sort of magical ability to influence dreams, but it isn't in their nature to be malicious towards people. Like I said, godlings are similar to human children in how they behave. Sarah might have been making people scared by thinking a house was haunted, but her motives can be categorized as survival at best — she made her home in an abandoned house after all — and mischievous at worst. What good would come of killing these little guys just because humanity considers them to be monsters? If anything, interacting with them has yielded useful results in Geralt's search for Ciri. Another example of this dissonance between man and monster is vampires, specifically higher vampires. While lesser vampires like Ekimaras and Fletters are driven by bloodlust and instinct, higher vampires are driven by intellect and emotions, similar to humans. However, unlike humans, higher vampires are extremely powerful. Their claws are just as strong as a steel blade. They could become invisible in the blink of an eye, and when driven to madness by rage or bloodlust, they have a bestial form that could make any other monster seem about as threatening as a newborn puppy. And don't even get me started on the Unseen Elder, being able to freeze higher vampires in place with a word, and straight up kill Geralt with one swift strike at the slightest annoyance. Higher vampires can definitely overthrow entire human societies if they wanted to, as demonstrated by Detloff in the Blood and Wine expansion. But higher vampires actually prefer to assimilate into human society. They would rather coexist with humans. Although higher vampires outclass humans in every category, humans outnumber them. Even if they would likely survive whatever witch hunt humans could create, they would rather not have to endure the hatred everywhere they go. Therefore, some choose to assimilate, pretending to be part of a race that they biologically are not. Or isolate themselves, remaining closed off from a world where they are a hated minority. Drinking blood is not even a necessity to a higher vampire for survival. Instead, it's the equivalent of alcohol for humans, a pleasurable pastime that can get them quite drunk. Of course, it's not like higher vampires are all cooperative, stoic individuals. The higher vampire Oriana has an orphanage set up where children willingly let her drink their blood to satisfy her pleasure in exchange for food and shelter. There's also the history of higher vampires where they used humans like cattle for torture and examination. Nonetheless, they are similar to humans in that each individual has their own unique perspectives, ideals, and emotions. Understanding this information is why one of Geralt's closest and most powerful allies is Regis, a higher vampire. Vampire is not enough evidence for you? Then how about dragons? Beasts that are more often than not the target of adventurers seeking recognition or wealth. There are several draconoids primarily driven by instinct and hunger that are not afraid to attack humans just like any other animal or lesser monster. However, Geralt outright refuses to slay true dragons. Dragons are extremely complex creatures that have been incredibly misrepresented by humans to justify their hunts to satisfy both their need for recognition and greed for the gold that dragons were known to hoard. Dragons are capable of complex thought, having their own unique personalities, and can even establish relationships with other races and species. The dragon villain Tretinmirth, let's just call him Villan for short, had a bit of a knightly code, challenging those who would come to hunt him to fight a fair duel, and even waited patiently for his challengers to think of a strategy. Rather than letting the dragon die, Geralt fought alongside him once he learned about the egg Villan was protecting. Years later, we come to find that the dragon who hatched out of the egg grew up to be Saskia, a dragon that used her human form to help create an independent kingdom in the north where any race could coexist freely and peacefully. These don't seem like your typical bringers of chaos, huh? The big unifier here is that Geralt doesn't kill sentient creatures that have the capacity to think and feel emotions like any other human. To him, killing trolls, dopplers, godlings, dragons, higher vampires, etc., just because someone is willing to pay him, is the same as committing murder. He'd be no better than a hired assassin. There's also the fact that fighting some of these is like throwing your life away, but his code still stands regardless. Yes, Geralt has had to kill some of these very same sentient creatures in the past, but only because there was a good reason to. Like when Geralt had to help kill the higher vampire Deadliest to save the lives of the people of Buckley. But this is no different from when he's been forced to fight and kill other humans. So monsters aren't always as monstrous as people expect them to be. Meanwhile, humans haven't always been the perfect picture of natural decency. Of course, you have individuals that commit monstrous actions, such as Whoreson Jr., who not only inherited his father's wealth after killing him, but also his sadistic tendencies, torturing and killing women for his twisted pleasure. But while these individuals are definitely monstrous human beings, they are still individuals, small members of society that the majority of human society would be repulsed by and later cast out if word of their actions ever got out. Or at least we hope that would be the natural response. However, humanity's ability to organize itself and focus their hatred on a single target makes them collectively just as dangerous and frightening as any monster, committing some of the most vile acts possible. There is no better example of this than the ironically titled Free City of Novigrad, where the bigotry and fear for anything deemed unnatural has taken a hold of the populace through an organized religion known as the Church of the Eternal Fire. Any practitioner of magic became the target of persecution for these fanatics. They would hunt humans, and especially non-humans, down like prey, subject them to painful and bloody torture to reveal information, and ultimately burn them alive in public as a demonstration to evoke fear in the masses. Geralt has witnessed firsthand how these witch hunters, as they called themselves, gained some sort of twisted pleasure out of these actions that they justified to themselves as exacting the will of a higher being. Confiscating the incredibly rare and valuable items that belonged to these mages also made these witch hunts quite the lucrative business. There are several different psychological mechanisms at work here that make these humans behave so destructively. On an internal level, we have active fear centers within the brain that determine our emotional responses to certain objects or events. The amygdala being the region of the brain documented for having a huge influence on this task. When we perceive something to be threatening, then our natural response will be fear. This fear will direct the person to respond by either running away or fighting. Naturally, the larger and more active these fear centers are in the individual, the more likely they are to respond to things with fear, and subsequently with anger. A pattern that I suspect happens all too often in the Witcher world. After all, humans live constantly surrounded by forces that are straight up more powerful than them. These fear centers are likely to be incredibly active, which, despite the cruelty that can come from it, allows for humans to survive in this world. On an external level, we have stereotypes that can form out of this fear. Stereotypes are fixed, overgeneralized beliefs about a particular group or class of people, including what humans classify as monsters. By simplifying our social world, we reduce the processing power necessary for understanding it. Meaning, it's a lot easier and quicker to respond to situations involving these groups of different people if you generalize them all as being the same. Like assuming all mages are selfish and destructive forces that scheme, murder kings, and start wars. Or that witchers are all heartless and emotionless mutants who kidnap children to subject them to the same fate. Or that any non-human is a senseless monster that will kill everything on sight. By generalizing groups, you can make decisions on how to interact with them a lot easier. It's much easier to torture a mage if you believe all mages are evil. And it's a lot easier to kill a non-human if you think they are monsters incapable of thoughts and emotions. The dangerous issue with stereotypes is that it also makes people ignore differences between individuals. Thus, a lot of innocent people just trying to exist within the world are subject to the hatred from others who apply the actions of a few to the overall population. Lastly, on a community level, we have groupthink, the tendency for a group of people to make irrational decisions as a group that discourages the individual responsibility. Rather than having people think for themselves, people may choose to follow the will of the rest of the group in order to maintain group harmony. They refrain from expressing any doubt in judgment and just follow along with what the group decides. Groupthink is especially dangerous because individuals are likely to ignore any ethical or moral consequences for the group's actions, simply because they do not want to go against everyone else. Also, the fact that it's easier for an individual to remain anonymous within these larger groups also makes it easier for them to tolerate these moral consequences. This tendency to go along with the will of a group leaves humans vulnerable to charismatic leaders that would take advantage of that. Leaders that claim to be a part of said group and then call upon the group to take violent action against those the group fears. Even if the individual may disagree with some of the judgments made by the group, their fear of disrupting the group harmony and being seen as a dissenter overrides their judgment. So when you have humans who have very active fear centers, who perpetuate and are exposed to constant stereotypes of those different than them, and are all in the presence of a much larger group of other humans, making the individual more anonymous, with leaders espousing these stereotypes with no one else standing up against them, you have a perfect recipe for a riot filled by bigotry and hatred. It was one such riot that got Geralt killed once. It's just easier mentally to pin the world's problems on a group that is different from you. After all, witch hunts are never truly about witches. They're nothing more than humans trying to make themselves feel safer in the simplest and deadliest way possible. Therefore, the job of a witcher goes beyond killing monsters. Witchers are not simply trained to fight. They learn absolutely everything they can about all the other races and species that inhabit the world. They're practically really deadly biologists and sociologists. This is why I say a witcher's blade is not guided by hate and ignorance. It's guided by education and logic. As a result, they are capable of understanding what species are dangerous, which are harmless, and which are sentient. It is why, on several occasions, Geralt has refused to slay certain monsters on his path, and has even befriended several. Meanwhile, humanity's ability to organize itself under blind hatred and bigotry can make them just as dangerous, if not more so, than the same monsters they fear. With their collective knowledge, witchers act as a bridge between these different races and species. Thus, the title of monster is not exclusive to inhuman creatures for Geralt of Rivia. His job is to hunt actual monsters. And he will do just that, indiscriminately. Thank you all so much for watching. I just wanted to take some time to let you guys know that I set up an official Instagram for the channel. Yeah, I'll be using it for advertising here and there, but I'll also post video topics that may not make its way to YouTube for some time, and some fun behind the scenes stuff. So if you're interested, give me a follow. And as always, my people, thank you for watching.